Welcome to A-Push. Today we're going to stay in the North and move forward the narrative of the founding of New England. So, of course, here are your objectives for today. Take a moment, pause, process them, and copy them down. And, without further ado, we're going to dive into the story of New England and the Puritans. So, as you hopefully remember from last time, there was some religious conflict in England that kicked off this whole process of Puritan immigration. Charles I and his friend Archbishop William Laud were trying to create religious conformity in England by forcing everyone to adopt similar religious practices, which of course outraged Puritans who thought the Church of England was too Catholic. And, incidentally, it also outraged Scots who started a war over this whole thing. And when the bishop started reading from the Book of Common Prayer, there was a riot with angry Scottish women throwing everything that they could find at the bishop. But a lot of Puritans simply decided to leave as opposed to, attack their bishops. So that brings us back to Plymouth Colony. You hopefully remember Plymouth Colony from last unit. This is your pilgrim showing up, and then there's happy Thanksgiving and all that fun stuff. Well, within 3 years, the whole thing has broken down. The alliance between the Wampanoag and the increasing numbers of pilgrims is becoming problematic. And so the leader of the pilgrims, a leader of the pilgrims, Miles Standish, leads a raid on the Wampanoag people, burning a village and driving the people off. As word of this new aggressive posture spread, many Native Americans abandoned their villages and moved to the west in basically a repeating pattern of conflict between English settlers and Native Americans. So now, as opposed to being friends with the Native Americans, the pilgrims are driving them off their land in order to accommodate increasing English settlement. This brings us to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. About a decade after the founding of Plymouth, a much larger group of Puritans from the Massachusetts Bay Company come over and start settling in what is today Boston. They are again Congregational Puritans, which means that they want local churches to have control over how people worship, and they don't like the complicated rituals, cathedrals, bishops of the English Church. And so they set out to found a new utopian community in Massachusetts. So whereas the southern part of Massachusetts was founded and settled by the Pilgrims in Plymouth, the Puritans founded the much larger Massachusetts Bay Colony with the cities of Boston and Salem, which you've probably heard of. Whereas the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower with one ship, the Puritans, in their first group, led by John Winthrop, sent over 1,000 Puritans on 15 ships, allowing them to very quickly establish a position along the coast and to easily drive off the local Native American tribes. This much larger process allowed the Massachusetts Bay colonists to basically ignore the Native Americans and believe them as more or less incompetent savages, as the Massachusetts Bay seal here shows, as opposed to the Pilgrims, who had to cultivate military alliances with the Native Americans to help themselves survive. So Massachusetts Bay is going to mostly ignore Native Americans until you start to get large-scale warfare between the two sides. As these groups of Puritans came over in congregations, they tended to settle all in these sort of self-contained towns. This is a town map of colonial New England, and you'll see here that you have a town hall, of course, and a school, which was incredibly important for Puritans because they believed that everyone should be able to read the Bible. They would, of course, also have a church and a minister's house, a common mill that everyone could use, and a lot of common ground for all of the settlers to be able to use. And so you're seeing people come over in families and congregations, which led to a much more stable and well-balanced society than you're going to see in many other regions of the British colonial empire. Puritans believed themselves on a mission from God to establish a perfect community, John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill, as you read in the readings today. And so their society had very strict religious restrictions on people, arguing that every person in the community needed to be a member of the church in good standing, which meant that they needed to be able to explain how and why they knew that God had chosen them to be saved. You see, the Puritans were Calvinists, which meant they believed in predestination, the idea that God chose some people at the beginning of time to be saved and some people to be not saved or damned. And so how do you know that you're a member of the elect and you're saved? Well, you can tell people exactly how, like the moment at which you realize that you were a member of the elect, and you act like a member of the elect. Because, of course, a member of the elect would act in specific ways to show that they're a member of the elect. Whereas people who are not a member of the elect, they wouldn't be able to describe the moment that they knew that they were saved, and they would act not like a member of the elect. Hence, they can't be a member of the elect. And so because of this, you have very strict rules. Punishments were harsh and public in order to shame people into returning to proper behavior, to prove that they're a member of the elect, obviously. And of course, as you read in Nathaniel Hawthorne's excellent book, The Scarlet Letter, if you broke these sort of taboos, you were shamed and potentially driven out of society and forced to wear letters acknowledging your adultery and such. The first leader of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was John Winthrop. We see him here. He, of course, is most responsible for the famous speech, A Model of Christian Charity, where he outlined the phrase, a city upon the hill, the idea that Massachusetts Bay is this religious utopia that is an example to everyone. And if they no longer exist as an example to everyone, then God will smite them from this earth and everyone will die. So no pressure, just live an absolutely perfect life according to Puritan rules. John Winthrop established mandatory education because, of course, a member of the elect would be able to read the Bible. And so children, both boys and girls, were educated in order to, boys, of course, because they have to read the Bible, and girls because they would partially be responsible for raising young boys in order to ensure that they could also read and be responsible members of society. And parents would often be punished harshly if their children did not perform up to snuff in school and were not adequately educated. Puritan education, of course, is pretty much religiously based. I'll give you a second here to look through these ABCs, which are horrifying. And it's rote memorization. The educational pedagogy was not very extensive at this point, or was not very sophisticated, I should say. Although the Puritans were a predominantly religious or were an exclusively religious society, ministers were forbidden from holding political office, and there was a separation of church and state in Massachusetts. So despite the fact that they had strict religious laws, the civil authorities were separate from the religious authorities. And so that's an important distinction to make. In the end, there was controversy within Puritan society, as certain people did not want to adhere to these strict Puritan ideals or disagreed with Puritan leaders about what these ideals should be and what the rules should be. The most famous of which is Governor Cotton, who succeeded Governor Winthrop, had a conflict with a guy named Roger Williams over both interpretations of the Bible and whether or not the Native Americans should be treated like people. Williams argued that they should, and Cotton argued that they should not. So this debate ended up leading to the trial and exile of Roger Williams, leading to the creation of new colonies. The colony that Roger Williams founded after being kicked out of Massachusetts Bay was called Rhode Island. You can see it here just south of Massachusetts Bay. It was still a Puritan society, and Roger Williams was, of course, the governor or leader or whatever you will of Rhode Island. Here's an older Roger Williams. He purchased land from the Native Americans as opposed to just seizing it from them, which, sounds good, but you have to remember that Native Americans had different concepts of land ownership. And so whether or not the tribes really understood that they were permanently selling their land to Roger Williams is somewhat of a historical debate. So they would expect, of course, that after, the owner died, it would go back to the Native Americans, whereas the citizens of Rhode Island would pass it down to their kids in a way that is complete anathema to how Native Americans would have reacted. But they did have better relations with Native Americans than the Puritans did, although it's difficult to have worse relations. So that's good. And of course, they were somewhat more tolerant because Roger Williams, having been kicked out of Massachusetts Bay for not following their strict rules, was hesitant to then impose strict rules upon the settlers of Rhode Island. So Rhode Island became a refuge for people who had been kicked out or didn't want to live in Massachusetts Bay anymore. Here's Roger Williams talking to some Native Americans. And here are people being exiled from Massachusetts Bay to go live in Rhode Island. Oh, and here's Roger Williams welcoming in the persecuted. Oh, look how happy they are. They've got a gun and a baby. Clearly, you need to live in Rhode Island. Although Rhode Island was very tolerant, it was not exclusively tolerant. For example, Anne Hutchinson had been kicked out of Massachusetts Bay because she committed the double sin of, on the one hand, questioning church elders, and secondarily, being a woman. And so the combination of those two things meant that she's straight out of Massachusetts. But once she moved to Rhode Island, it turned out she kept on both being a woman and also having ideas about church, which the Rhode Islanders were tolerant, but I mean, that's just one bridge too far. And so she was also exiled from Rhode Island, where she was eventually then moved to upstate New York, where she was killed by Native Americans. But for many, Anne Hutchinson exists as an early example of women pushing back against some of the restrictive roles that are placed on them. And so she sometimes gets the title of the first American feminist, despite that not totally fitting like a realistic narrative. You also, at about the same time, have the founding of Connecticut. I've read both sides of this. I've read that Connecticut was founded by just Puritans who, like, Massachusetts had filled up, and so they needed to move on to Connecticut. I'd read that. I'd read that the Puritans who were moving to Connecticut were super Puritans who wanted their communities to be more strict than Massachusetts was, as they had argued that over the last couple of years, Massachusetts had become more tolerant and less pure. And I've seen it argued that they were escaping from the oppressiveness of Massachusetts Bay. So I think as far as who's coming to Connecticut, I think it really depends. And probably all three of these stories are true to some degree, depending on which immigrants you're talking about. But the guy who's given credit for founding Connecticut is Thomas Hooker, and he moved into the Connecticut River Valley here, right next to Rhode Island. Connecticut is noteworthy for a couple different reasons. One, Thomas Hooker. Here's a fabulous statue of him looking very dapper and holding his hat. It's exciting. Connecticut is important because they had the first written constitution, something called the Fundamental Orders, which laid out their theory of government. The Pilgrims, of course, had the Mayflower Compact, which is considered the first government document, but the Mayflower Compact just had broad ideals, not specific governing principles and laws. So here we are, Thomas Hooker. Everyone should be allowed to vote, not just church members, because, of course, in Massachusetts Bay, only church members of good standing could vote for things in their town hall meetings, whereas in Connecticut, all members of the community could vote. We'll be coming back to this question of who could vote and who had representation in Puritan society in a couple days. But for now, Connecticut and Rhode Island, more tolerant than Massachusetts Bay. Moving to Connecticut also kicked off the first large-scale Native American war in the North, the Pequot Wars. The Pequot were a group of Native Americans living up along the Connecticut River Valley here who weren't particularly happy with large amounts of Puritans moving in. And so, what happens. In the end, some traders killed some Native Americans killed some colonists killed some Native Americans, and before you know it, the settlers in Connecticut built a Native American coalition to go and attack the Pequot. The Pequot War was a series of battles along the coast here, but the Mystic River Massacre, or the Mystic River Battle, depending on who you talk to, was the culminating moment of the war. At Mystic River, a group of Puritans surrounded a Native American village and then set fire to said village. Here's the Pequot Fort at Mystic River. And after it was surrounded, they set it on fire, and then anyone who tried to escape was shot. And so the massacre killed every man, woman, and child in the village. It broke the spirit of the Pequots, and even the allied tribes who had joined together because of their mutual enmity for the Pequots saw the brutality of the Puritans and thought, we better get the heck out of here. And so the Pequot War led to the migration out of eastern and southern New England, with Native Americans trying to find new places to live where they were less likely to be burned to death and then shot. So that brings us back to our standards. pause and make sure you can provide a reasonable answer to each of these prompts. And we'll see you back tomorrow when we move back south to Virginia again.